Welcome, everyone, to the ICSS Sunday Morning Marxist Forum. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the Program Committee for ICSS Sunday Morning Sessions. We are based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarks.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday sessions. You can also view past presentations and send us a message using our contact form on our website, which again is icssmarks.org. And we want to call your attention to our donation icon on our homepage and a donation page itself where you can make a donation to support our programs. We're here today to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. But today's session is more than just a celebration. We're here also to draw the lessons of the historic victory as they apply to Victory Day 2525 today. What we're going to do today is slightly different. We're going to have a discussion section. We want to have a lively discussion, informative discussion, and I'm going to start with a brief introduction followed by some short presentations by several program committee members to get the discussion going. Everyone is welcome to join in by expressing your thoughts, your opinions, or simply by asking questions. So what we're going to do is start off with an introduction, a few short opinions and comments by program committee members. Then we're going to open it up to discussion. So it's going to be more of a round table type organization than simply Q&A. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so I'll start with an introduction. Whoops. All right. Okay, to understand the reasons for the victory 80 years ago, we have to turn the clock back over 100 years. Germany underwent an industrial revolution in the mid-19th century and became a modern industrial capitalist powerhouse by the early 20th century. By World War I, Germany was the third largest economy measured by gross domestic product in the world, the third largest economy, behind the US and the UK, and was a leading producer of coal, steel, chemicals, machine tools, and electrical generation equipment. Large industrial and financial monopolies that we know today, Krupp, Siemens, IG Farben, and the Deutsche Bank, dominated their economy. Germany was a world leader in industrial technology and scientific research. Russia, on the other hand, lagged behind the other capitalist powers in economic development. They lagged behind in advanced manufacturing industries such as chemicals and machine tool production. 80% of the Russian working population was employed in agriculture, compared to 35% in Germany. And their agricultural sector was still dominated by feudal land ownership and farmed using the most backward agricultural technologies, things like wooden plows. Underdeveloped Russia versus industrialized Germany. In 1914, Germany's GDP was 10 times that of Russia's. In other words, Germany's GDP was $400 billion versus $40 billion in 1914 dollars, 10 times greater. Let's fast forward to 1941. By 1941, just before the invasion, let's jump into the invasion a bit. Industrialized, militarized Germany launched its invasion of the USSR, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military invasion in world history. This will come up multiple times today, but the scale of the invasion was colossal. It's hard to even imagine. more than 3.8 million troops invaded Soviet Russia, a force consisting of soldiers from Nazi Germany and other Axis countries, Romania, Finland, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, and Croatia. The line of contact in the initial phase of the war extended over 1,800 miles from the north of the Soviet Union through to the south of the western region of the Soviet Union. The invading Axis forces were equipped with tens of thousands of pieces of military hardware, including 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. After the initial invasion, the war on the Eastern Front took place on a colossal military and industrial scale. Economically, hundreds of millions of tons of coal, oil, and steel, supporting over 34 million military personnel, Soviet military personnel, were committed to the battles. The Russians bore the brunt of defeating the Nazis. They faced as many as 200 Axis divisions at any given time versus 15 faced by the Allies on the Western Front. 80% of German casualties during World War II were suffered on the Eastern Front, fighting the Soviets. The Germans were outmanned, outgunned, and outproduced. Russian military technology prevailed, including innovative developments such as the T-34 tank and the Katyusha multiple rocket launcher. So let's fast forward to 1945. Germany was utterly defeated. How did Russia go from backward to victorious over the enormous, hitherto unbeatable German military industrial machine? Recall what I said earlier that just before the Nazi invasion, uh, just before the start of World War I, Russia's economy was 1/10 the size of Germany's. So before World War I, the Russian economy was 1/10 the size of Germany's. By 1941, just before the Nazi invasion, Russia had the second largest GDP of any country in the world, behind only the US. Germany was third. Between 1928 and 1938, the Soviet economy grew by 200%. 10-year period, the output of the economy doubled. Between 1914 and 1941, Russian GDP caught up to the German GDP, and which was over 10 times larger in 1914. Yet on the 80th anniversary of Victory Day, there is every manner of belittlement and criticism of the Soviet war effort, if it is not ignored outright. Some of the things that we hear, and we hear them everywhere in the discussions about the war. The Soviets were surprised and unprepared for the Soviet invasion. Stalin panicked and went into hiding at the launch of Operation Barbarossa. The dictator Stalin, the dictator Stalin, the dictator Stalin crippled the Soviet officer corps through arbitrary purges. Soviet central planning was inefficient and hindered the war effort. The Allies were the main source of the military industrial support for the Soviet war effort through the Lend-Lease program. NKVD troops, NKVD was the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the Soviets, were deployed behind Soviet soldiers and terrorized them into fighting. So on and so on and so on, the mainstream bourgeois narrative goes. But think about it. If this narrative is true, then why and how did the Soviet Union win the war? And I'm going to ask everybody to just stop for a moment and think about this. How and why did the Soviets win the war? The mainstream narrative that I described above is totally inconsistent with the undeniable outcome of the Soviet victory. Well, what are some of the lessons to be learned? I'm just going to mention three of them to go into this. Number one, oppressed people have a boundless capacity to resist. The German master plan for the East, the Generalplan Ost, aimed at the ethnic cleansing and extermination of millions of Slavs and other non-Germanic people in Eastern Europe. Tens of millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians perished resisting the Nazis on the Eastern Front, as well as others from other Eastern European countries. In World War II itself, 20 million Chinese perished defeating Japanese imperialism. Other examples of oppressed people resisting. The Algerians against the French lost 1 million people in 1 week in 1944, resisting the Algerian colonialism. The Korean people against the Japanese and US imperialists lost 3 to 4 million. The Vietnamese against the French, Japanese Americans lost 2 to 3 million. And the ongoing resistance by the Palestinian masses to their genocide, backed by the US Zionist regime, is unimaginable. We don't even know those numbers yet. Perhaps the greatest modern day example of a people refusing to submit are the Yemenis, who are who have been resisting Zionist aggression against them and US aggression against them and the Palestinians. The first lesson is when back to the wall, oppressed people resist. The second lesson that I would call your attention to is that Soviet industrialization and preparation for the war was nothing short of a miracle. The Soviet collectivization of agriculture made industrialization possible. And without industrialization, the Soviet Union and its allies could have never defeated the, the behemoth Nazi regime. Russia overcame a tenfold disadvantage over the Germans in less than 20 years. The economy industrialized between 1928 and 1938, growing by 200% in the 10 years leading up to the war. This constitutes nothing short of one of the greatest achievements in human history. It's not an exaggeration. I would add that it also proves the possibility and the superiority of socialist industrialization under unimaginably difficult circumstances. Third lesson I want to call your attention to: the role of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, organizing and leading the Soviet people to victory. The Soviet civilian and military mobilization and organization of the war effort was nothing short of a miracle itself. It must be noted that the courageous and successful resistance to the Nazis throughout occupied Europe was also led by communist parties following the principles of Marxism-Leninism. This is an undeniable truth. It stands in complete contrast to the babbling idiocy of British and American military academics and military analysts who berate, deny, and distort the role of the Soviet Union, and in particular, the Soviet Communist Party and communist parties throughout Europe in defeating the Nazi monster. Finally, this brings us to Victory Day 2025. The world today is divided between those who support and celebrate the victory over the Nazis in Europe and those who denigrate and deny it. This reflects the division between the 29 heads of state who attended the 2025 Victory Day celebration in Moscow versus those who barred the Russians from ceremonies commemorating the Soviet liberation of Auschwitz and Birkenau death camps. It's the difference between those who are building monuments to the victory over the Nazis versus those who are defacing and destroying them in Ukraine and other parts of the Balkans and Western Europe. It's the difference between those who celebrate the Ukrainian Banderist Nazi collaborators, salute them at their victory parade, versus the Russians who are fighting them today and defeating them. It reflects those who invited the Ukrainian SS Gruppen to speak at their parliament in Canada and applauded them versus the millions who recognized and celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory across the globe. Comrades, we're in a period of great crisis and upheaval where the conditions that breed fascism are rising once again around the globe. We must never forget the lessons of the historic and miraculous victory over the Nazis by the Soviet Union in World War II. So, with that, what we're going to do is we're going to shift over and ask people to speak your mind, what you think, what you learned, what you know about the Soviet victory. And we're going to have a little bit different format today. It's going to be not just a speaker and answering questions. You're welcome to ask questions, make comments, express your opinions. You can ask questions of others who are participating in the discussion. We're going to make it more of a round table. So with that, we'll get started. I think I'm going to ask Jean if you want to go ahead and get started to kind of break the ice and get the discussion going. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks, Alan. A great introduction. And thank you and the other members of the program committee for putting this discussion together. And I particularly appreciate that the picture. And I remember what I think Winston Churchill said, that it was the Red Army under the leadership of Stalin that tore the guts out of the filthy Nazi war machine. And I think that's something, as you said, as a good American and product of American education system, I always thought that, well, we won the war, but we never think to include the Soviets in that we won the war. So that's good. And the other thing, as you also mentioned, you know, Stalin had the foresight when he came to power to institute what people have called the Second Russian Revolution. He said that the imperialists are 100 years ahead of us economically. Either we make up that difference in 10 years or they will crush us. And so it was, the guts of the Red Army, the Soviet people, and the leadership of Joseph Stalin that I think it's very important for us to remember. But I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for your introduction, and I'll listen and learn. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, next we're going to ask Raj to step forward and express some ideas about the victory. So Raj, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, Alan, after what you said, I will probably have only some details to add, but there are some complementary things. I have a slide presentation, so if I may, I will share my slides with everybody here. Okay. Let me know if you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So let me adjust this. How do I get? Okay, very good. All right, so where does it begin? I think the 1848 European Revolution is the starting point that lit the spark against the feudal despotism by the wretched of the earth. It eventually turned into a prairie fire. This is the famous words of Mao in 1917 Russia, and went on to destroy capitalism in the weakest link of capitalism in its imperialist stage, and that is attributed to Lenin. All right, but the British and French, Dutch, Spanish and Portuguese still enslaved peoples of Asia and US-dominated Philippines and Latin America. So much of the people, even after that 17 revolution, were still enslaved. Either they were colonized or semi-colonized. In 1945, in substance, the VE Day represents the victory of socialism over Italian and German imperialism, as Alan said. But what followed, revolutions in China, Korea, Vietnam, national liberation of India and the rest of Asia and Africa, was the larger achievement, I would say. So this is really an important thing that I'm supplementing what what Alan actually implied, but I'm saying more so openly. So I'm going to say, let us begin there. I have an image of Lenin inspecting the troops, so to speak. This is 1917. I think these are soldiers and workers who overthrew and gained power. So there's an iconic picture. I thought I should share it with you. Now, USSR, I would go a little bit, Alan mentioned about what a great achievement it was, that in 20 years, from about 1921, they took on world's very significant military power, Germany, and it's not just Germany, the Axis power. So, but it all begins in 1928, of course, starts with Russian Revolution, but the first few years, there was new economic policy. They had to kind of get economy going, devastated economy from civil war, etc. So the first 5-year plan was adopted in 1928 under the leadership of Stalin by the party. The building of new factories, state farms, and collective farms was developed on a vast scale. The socialist advance sharpened the class struggle in the country and the struggle within the party also. The victory over the kulaks, which are the rich peasants who hired labor and gained surplus value, and over the left and right deviationists in the party consolidated Soviet power. Sorry, I accidentally went further than I meant. Okay. Give me a second here. Okay. All right. So then began the building of heavy industry. And how was that achieved? By trading grains and raw materials with Germany, which needed those for heavy machinery. Now, Soviets were, and Germany, both were, couldn't trade with other countries. They had sanctions. Sanctions are not a new thing. As you know, Russia is the most heavily sanctioned country, and Iran is, but Soviet Union and Germany were also after First World War. So they had an agreement to trade between themselves. The trade that went on almost to the day the invasion came in 1941. The socialist advanced, okay, so the heavy industry began with that. And the Communist Party organized the working class and the peasantry for the fulfillment of the first 5-year plan, 1928 to 32, and the second and for the socialist construction of the USSR. So that was the first 5-year plan, completely planned construction. It was not an economy built for commodities for selling all over the world. It was truly a socialist economy. By 1929, the swing of the middle peasant towards the collective farms and the beginning of a mass collective farm movement was achieved. So this is the first phase of that construction, the amazing, miraculous. I agree with Alan's words. And then the critical period, 1929 to 39, the second 5-year plan was from 32 to 37, and the third was from 1938 to 42. The war came in 41, the invasion came in June 41, but this plan was completed, and that completed the socialist construction of the USSR, within the USSR. During worldwide depression of 1929 to 37, the USSR industry made progress. By the middle of 1937, world capitalist industry was below that of 1929. The USSR had attained over 4 times of the output of 1929 and over 7 times pre-First World War output of 1913. Now, the grain harvest increased from 86 million tons in 1913 to 122 million tons in 1937, 44% increase. That doesn't seem like much, but given the destruction of First World War and Civil War, this is a very impressive achievement. The raw cotton crop went from 0.8 million tons to 2.8 million, which is 350% increase, and similar increases in other crops from 50 to 250% were achieved. In 1937, collective farms alone, without the state farms, which, by the way, were about 15% of the land, state farms. So it's without them, produced a marketable surplus of grains of over 31 million metric tons of grain, which was 30% more than the landlords, kulaks, and peasants together marketed in 1913. So if you add another 15%, it'll be much more because the state farms are not counted in there. Only one branch of agriculture, livestock farming, lagged the pre-war level, and its progress was at a slower rate, mainly because kulaks had slaughtered their animals rather than given for collective farming. And that's why the animal population had drastically gone down, the horses and other animals, cows and so forth. The collectivization in agriculture was completed. 93% of peasant households had joined the collective farms by 1937. Many Americans economists say this was forced. No, it was not forced. It was mostly voluntary. There was some cases of coercion, but this was coercion done by the collective farmers themselves, not from the government. The grain crop area of the collective farms amounted to 99% of the total grain crop area of the peasant. 1% was still privately farmed, by the way. Private farming was not completely eliminated. Now, I'll come to the USSR strategy, diplomacy, and war preparation. Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister in 1936 Munich Agreement, he's often derided as a fool, but he was no fool. He placated Hitler to direct the Nazi wolf eastward by ceding Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia to Germany. Czechoslovakia was not even invited. It was handed over. British Prime Minister hands over other countries' part to Hitler without asking that country. Stalin, of course, was not invited either. So from this, it becomes clear what the intention was. The greater enemy was Soviet Union because socialism is the enemy of capitalism. Germany was a capitalist country. Of course, they were worried about Hitler, but if he destroyed Soviet Union, they were going to be happy. And I didn't know how far Hitler would go. That also they didn't know. The USSR offer of alliance with either France or Britain, they said at least one of you have to sign up with us a pact to deter the Nazi attack for mutual defense. But that was deflected. Okay, they played with it. They basically played with Stalin. Stalin was no fool. Now, the other thing was there was an anti-Comintern pact. And according to that, while Hitler was to attack from the west, Japan was to attack from the east, and a two-front war would have been much more difficult as it is. The Western Front War was difficult, very difficult, but two-front war would have been very, very much more so, right? And so one of the things that happened is that Stalin turned the tables by having, in 1939, in September, in August, actually it was earlier, but later on was modified in September. So August 1939, Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact was signed. It was not an alliance, it was a non-aggression pact. And it was modified in September to demarcate the line to limit Hitler's forces in Poland. Should Hitler attack Poland, it cannot go further than that. Otherwise, he will have to face Soviet forces. And east of there was the area of Poland that Poland had seized from Russia. So the charge that somehow the country was divided between the two, which is the bourgeoisie say, is not true. Soviets did not take any part that was not theirs, which they had lost when Soviet power was weak to Poland. Okay, Germany invaded France in May 1940, and within a very short time, I think it was a week to a month, I forget, it conquered France. Entire French preparation was for nothing. That is when Britain entered the war. Now there was no question that their own survival was at stake. That's when they joined. So Stalin first tried it, and then he turned the tables on them, and finally he got the result he wanted, because but Hitler, it was not Hitler's intention to conquer England or anything like that. So he basically wanted his back to be safe before he goes for his attack on Soviet Union. Germany, Italy, Japan, the major Axis plan to coordinate. Okay, I mentioned this, but so it was a great diplomatic victory of the USSR to get USSR-Japan neutrality pact so that the USSR could avoid a two-front war. USSR war production was organized in 1933, tanks, warplanes, heavy artillery, guns, etc. The non-aggression pact gave the USSR, with Germany that I'm talking about, 21 critical additional months for preparation, and it was barely enough. As Gene mentioned, Stalin had said that we have to cover 50 to 100 years of advancement in Germany in 10 years. And he had said we have at most 10 years to prepare, and they got only 8. On June 22nd, early morning at about 4 a.m., 3.8, I think I'm corrected, 3.5 is not correct, 3.8 million soldiers of Axis powers of Germany, many countries, Alan already mentioned, invaded along 1,800 miles, as Alan already said. So USSR in the Second World War mobilized the highest number, which was more than 25% of total, 34 million. Germany, 18 million, Japan and Italy, 9 million each. So between these, it was 36 million. Britain, 8 million, mostly us Indians fought for him, for the Britain. Only their officers fought, mostly the colonial army of Britain were the Indian army. Indian, that means the entire subcontinent, not just India. Anyway, so I come down to lessons of Victory Day, Victory in Europe Day, VE. A genuine socialist system can defeat capitalist imperialist system. That's the first lesson. Second, a genuine national liberation is possible only under socialism. Third, massive destruction of capital can revitalize capitalism, get it out of imperialist stage for a generation or so. That is what happened. United States and Western Europe got that destruction of capital. United States was hardly touched by Second World War destruction. It was touched, but the war didn't come home that much. Soldiers were lost. About 500,000 Americans also gave their life. They contributed to the victory, VE Day, which should not be disregarded. But as Alan mentioned, most of it was Eastern Front, which was the Soviet Union. So one of the lessons is that capitalism can reinvigorate itself by this massive destruction of capital. But capitalism, once again, inevitable reach, again, it's imperialist stage. That's the mechanics of capitalism. The economic crisis can be postponed, but not solved by credit expansion or what is the same printing of currency bills, which is what's going on as you see here, right? We've been watching this happen for the last several, both Republican and Democratic administration. Now Trump wants to do something else, but I don't think it's all that different. Huge capitalist overproduction is also causing irreversible environmental crisis, which is something new. This was not as big an issue when VE Day was celebrated. Working class in the US, 2/3 cannot make ends meet today. So this is what imperialism has produced, this capitalist development. Peace and industrial development cannot be met under the conditions of this industrial capitalism that is being attempted, at least in my judgment. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Okay, so before we go to Sharon, who's the last of our organized people to comment, could people should go to the bottom the bottom of your screen, the reactions button. Raise your hand if you have something to contribute. We're going to call on people today. This is a roundtable discussion. It's not speakers and then questions of speakers. It's really more of a general discussion. So please go ahead and start raising your hand if you have something you want to contribute, something you want to ask. And with that, we'll go to Sharon. So please go ahead, Sharon.
Thank you. I just have a few comments about how the war looked from the United States, how the history of the war is regarded in the United States, and the role of the Communist Party during the war. So first of all, obviously, the war never touched our shores except Pearl Harbor. And that was not insignificant, of course, but in fact, almost no Americans experienced war on their homeland, as opposed to Europe. So the United States lost 400,000 armed forces. And that's nothing to sneeze at, of course, but it pales in comparison to the 30 million Soviet citizens who lost their lives. And that does not include all those maimed and disabled who survived the war. And then, as Raj put in some more data about other countries in Europe who mobilized a lot of armed forces, and many people died. And I would say that, the families of the 400,000 in the United States have a generational memory, passed down memory of that. And that is not insignificant, but it is not the entire population by any means. Whereas there's no one in Russia and the former Soviet Union that does not remember the war in a familial sense. And that's true of most other countries in Europe. I had the occasion to meet a graduate student at Cal who was from Italy. She came to the Marxist Library to ask us something. And we got to talking, and she said, there's no Italian family that does not remember the war because of the history of their family's involvement. And that is true in France and Britain as well, and Germany, other countries in Europe. So that, I think, is very significant when we teach history. I wanted to say something about the use of the term miracle. So yes, it does feel miraculous that the Soviet Union was able to industrialize so fast, but it's not a miracle. We don't believe in God. We believe in people and nature. And That was the achievement of socialism. And so was the victory, as other people have already said. In addition to the huge industrialization that happened and the preparations for war that this Soviet leadership knew was coming, they also miraculously moved whole factories to the east. I don't have the data of how many and how large that movement was, but I know it happened. They picked up factories and moved them to the east, out of the way of the invading German onslaught. They also moved people. They moved a lot of Jewish people to work in those factories that were moved east because they knew they would be the first victims of the SS. So I want to just come to the particular role of the Communist Party in the United States. So first of all, in the 1930s or late 30s, the US population was overwhelmingly opposed to US involvement in war, and in particular, the unfolding pre-war situation in Europe. And of course, there were two different lines. There was the pro-fascist, who were very, very active, and the America First Committee, which we now have echoes of, was the kind of umbrella, and there were many other groups, was putting out its propaganda, and a considerable portion of the capitalists agreed with them. And then there were the liberal isolationists, or the liberals again, who were also opposed to US involvement in foreign wars, and particularly in Europe. Interestingly enough, some of those capitalists who were against any involvement in Europe, or might even have been pro-Hitler, were more interested in a war in Asia to open up markets, to get markets in Asia away from the Japanese. But that's a whole other story. So the communists were, who might have wanted to expand the commitment of the United States to defend all of Europe, but in particular the Soviet Union, we're up against this enormous isolationist bent among the US working class. And long story short, that changed when the Soviet Union was invaded. And then the Communist Party came out for US support for the Soviet Union and support for Britain and France and US involvement in the war. But they were also hobbled by several factors. One was the Voorhees Act and the Smith Act were both passed in 1940, and many communist leaders landed in prison. And including the chairman of the Communist Party, Earl Browder. And so Earl Browder had a very reactionary line. He was a social democrat at best. And it wasn't just after the war, when we all know that he dissolved the Communist Party for a while. But before and during the war, he also had very incorrect positions in several important areas. And one was that the party passed a resolution, or passed a policy that only US citizens could be members of the party, which immediately excluded 4,000 foreign-born people. They also supported Browder from prison actually wanted the party to support something called incentive wages, which were, workers would get paid according to their production, which was very reactionary. Um, but even so, even despite some wrong-headed policies, once the war started and during the war, the party played an important role. They sent thousands of their cadre, their members, into the war effort, and into the factories, um, and very importantly, they led the way. They led the demand for the opening of a second front, which didn't happen. The United States opening a second front did not happen for several years. The US troops landed in Italy in September of 43, and we all know that Normandy Beach happened in June of 44. But that was very late in the war, as they were, the US ruling class as a whole was quite content to let Germany ravage the Soviet Union. I guess the only thing I'll say is Browder was motivated by a completely wrong understanding of what the war represented, and trust for the ruling class, and for US imperialism. And after the war, they dissolved the party and formed the Communist Association or something like that. They ruined the party, essentially. And it took many, many years to even overcome that. Oh, I wanted to say one other mistake that was made. So the party, to its disgrace, actually, did not speak out, did not fight against the internment of Japanese Americans. And they just didn't get it. They did not get the national question and the fight against white supremacy, even though they had been very, very good, strong and good about fighting for against the oppression of African Americans. That was the only. It's still incongruous for me to understand. I don't really understand that, because they were so good on the fight against racism against Black people, and so horribly bad on the fight against racism in any other sense. So I'll just leave it at that. It's a question that I don't have a good answer to.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Okay, so we're going to open this up now to a roundtable discussion. People, if you want to say something, if you want to ask a question, express an idea, make a comment, please raise your hand. Try and call on people. Might be a little bit looser about the order in which hands are raised, but let's try to get a discussion going here. I think there are a lot of people here who have things to contribute, lots of ideas and knowledge about the significance of Victory Day. So I'm going to start with Peter. Go ahead, Peter. If you want to just make a comment, please go ahead, or ask a question. You're welcome to the group or any of the speakers.
Okay, hopefully you can
We
hear
got
me.
you. Yes.
Good, good. I'm in my car. I'm really sorry, Alan. I came in too late to hear your talk. I was very much looking forward to it. I'll watch it on the replays. Because I often find myself agreeing with almost everything you say, but I'll bring up something that it just has really struck me in the last month or so, or even more than a month. Really, really kind of dovetails with the whole issue of the American view of Europe and of Russia and the Soviet Union. We've seen over and over again for years now that Biden and the liberal Democrats consider Russia to be an implacable enemy no matter what. This is not by chance or by accident. This goes way back to even before World War II. It's been an enemy of the United States since the Soviets came to power. And this hiatus during World War II, where we had an alliance with Russia, was, if you really look at the details of the history, all in the middle of this alliance, the United States was continuing to plan and to, plan for when the war was over, how to destroy the Soviet Union. So this is really uh, not a complete alliance. It's a alliance of convenience for a short period of time, only so that the United States could continue its intended destruction of the Soviet Union. And of course, they came out of World War II almost untouched, unlike any other of the major powers, totally untouched in terms of the production and power of the military and the industrial productivity of the United States. So that continued up till today, where you hear these asinine politicians all the way from Biden to, well, I couldn't say Trump because he's not as inane as the Democrats, but Biden saying, Putin must go. Why does Putin must go? Well, because Russia is and has always been an enemy of Western capitalism. And this really contributes to the revision of world history of VE Day, where the United States pretends like the Soviet victory over fascism, where 83% of all the German deaths occurred on the Eastern Front. They pretend it just doesn't exist. They pretend that they send their Secretary of State to Canada to give a standing applause to a member of the Ukrainian resistance who happens to be a former SS member of the Waffen SS in Ukraine, a Nazi. That's the type of revision of world history that the Americans have created, and we we send NATO and our color revolution subversion people over to Europe to try and promote this really almost fascist ideology of the Balkan countries of making illegal German, Russian language and Russian history, removing all the statues, commemorating the Soviet liberation of their country, and instead resurrecting Nazi statues. I mean, it's just amazing what the United States has done in terms of revising history. And this isn't simply a right-wing conspiracy in the US. This is a left-wing conspiracy too. Look at the dozens and dozens and dozens of Trotskyist leftist organizations that have pretended like the Soviet victory never happened. They pretended that Trotsky was a great anti-fascist, even though he was collaborating in so many ways with the Western powers. It just from left to right, there's been a rewriting of history, and it just is mind-boggling that that from academia to intellectuals to the media to government, everybody has a united view that Russia is an enemy. And whether you're the leftist of left liberal or even Marxist to the rightist of right wing capitalists, everyone agrees that Russia is the enemy and must be broken up from the Rand Corporation to, you know, Joe Biden, they all believe the same thing. Anyway, that's my perspective. Yeah, I again, there just cannot possibly be enough said about the contributions of the Soviet Union to, you know, freeing us from fascism, while the U.S. sat back for years and years and did nothing, waiting for Hitler to destroy the Soviet Union. Luckily, not luckily, but as we know, the victor was socialism and it wasn't capitalism. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And also the fact that the Americans after the war rescued so much of the Nazi bureaucracy and brought them to Germany to continue the fight. Unforgivable, unforgivable. Uh, and I actually want to make a quick statement about that. You know, something to think about. Perhaps the bravest, the most courageous resistance to Nazism that took place during World War II was on the part of Germans, German resistors. People, thousands of Germans, social democrats and especially communists, were imprisoned and executed by the Nazis. Ernst Thälmann, who was the leader of the German Communist Party, was imprisoned at Buchenwald death camp during the war, and eventually, towards the end of the war, when the writing was on the wall about the German loss, was executed. So this is not Russia versus Germany, America versus Germany. It's really about Nazism and opposition to fascism, and we should honor the memory of those heroic resistors like the White Rose group in Germany that resisted the Nazis, and not look at this as a national confrontation. Okay, next is Lucy. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I'm not sure that I have much to add. People have said things that were definitely I agree with completely. My emphasis would be that the war seemed to have been a fight between imperialist powers. They were trying to divide the world, and that the Soviet Union, in the leadership of Stalin, saved us from is a horrendous future that that would have destroyed our planet much sooner than I don't know what would have happened. Of course, it's difficult to say what would have happened, but I have a lot of respect for Stalin. And I don't think Stalin deserves the kind of downgraded views that people have about him. And even though he may have been very hard, this was something necessary, I think, because there were so many enemies surrounding Russia. I think Russia was a big piece of prize that they all wanted. They were trying to, and I think that the German specifically were interested in Russia. That's the only thing that the whole world had already been divided. So Russia would have been a big prize. So that victory over the Nazis by the Russian people is incredibly significant, I think, for the survival of our planet and survival for socialism, especially. That's it.
Thank you. Next is Janet and then Goulden. So Janet, please go ahead and unmute and
Yeah, thank you. So I've been watching the Moscow Victory Day Parade on May 9th since 2022, live streamed from there. Very impressive. And although the whole the way that it's structured is pretty much the same year after year, there have been some changes, but and well, I brought this up before this the live stream went on, that the first Moscow Victory Day Parade was on June 24th, 1945, not May 9th. May 9th was the day the Germans surrendered to the Soviet Union. So anyway, I posted a link to, you can see a video of some of it, well, a lot of the parade, but I mean, the parade lasted in 1945, 2 hours. But there's like a sort of a 19-minute video in the link that I posted. I don't know if anybody, one of the hosts could play a little bit of it for us. It's very, very impressive. But I also wanted to say that this year's Victory Day Parade in Moscow, there were many foreign dignitaries, including, by the way, the Israeli ambassador to Russia was one of the dignitaries. But, Xi Jinping and Lula and many, well, a number of dignitaries were there. And also there were foreign contingents in addition to the former Soviet republics in the parade itself. But I mean, one of the things that has been concerning me is how Russia has not been intervening in the Palestine genocide. And I know it has something to do with the large number of Russian Israelis, and Russia protects its ethnic residents or in other countries. That's one of the reasons why Russia was went or supported the Donbass militants in 2022, the start of the special military operation. But by not intervening at all in the genocide, they're basically supporting Israeli Zionist genocide. It's like somewhat of a contradiction to me. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Gulden. So go ahead, Gulden.
Hi, I just wanted to add what Sharon actually mentioned about the Normandy. When I was working in the office, my coworkers believed that U.S. defeated Nazis with D-Day in June 6, 1944. And that's what they saw in their education, back in high school. And speaking of revising the history of United States, so there were big discussions between us. In reality, I told them, in reality, World War II actually continued another year. Germans were still fighting fiercely with Soviet Union. And finally, Soviet Union forced them to surrender on May 8, 1945. Stalin's victory speech on May 9, 1945, he mentioned that even though German forces are laying their arms and surrendering, there's still one group of German troops in Czechoslovakia still evading surrender. So the war was still going on after D-Day. And he said that, but I trust that the Red Army will be able to bring it to its senses. So that's what I wanted to mention that about D-Day. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to call on Polina, followed by Citizen One. So Polina, please go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. Lots of feelings as I'm listening to all of this and mixed. Well, first of all, I did grow up at the very end of the Soviet Union. I spent the first 13 years of my life in Moscow, and we left in the early 90s. And I just remember that the kind of nightmares I had as a child were about Nazi bombings because it was very much part of the historiography, the popular culture, the movies of the time. Even as a young kid, I was still exposed to the horrors that the Soviet people survived and fought. And I still cry when when I watch the May 9th parade and the music. It still makes me very emotional. My families on both sides were evacuated. My grandmother was a nurse, and she was, receiving the wounded as they were coming from the front, and she was evacuated with one of the wounded trains, and that's where she stayed. My other side of the family were part of those key industries that were evacuated. A lot of Jewish families were evacuated and saved as part of that effort of massive evacuations of past the Ural Mountains. Now, what makes me sad is really the way the post-Soviet space has contributed to the rewriting of history. So before this today's meeting, I asked my parents to reflect on their memories of the war. And, some of the first things that came out of their mouths were Stalin made a pact with Hitler. Stalin was unprepared. I asked him, well, my mother has a sister whose father perished in the war. My parents said, yes, that's true. He was missing in action. And that's because he was one of the first people that were sent to the front. And those were sent unarmed. They were cannon fodder. They were supposedly the first waves of Soviet soldiers were not even given arms. They were told to run and they were all killed. I said, Mom, Dad, how do you know this? Well, that's what history books tell now because Stalin, was awful. So all of that stuff is just, you can probably hear it in my voice. I'm indignant. I'm indignant because of the way the anti-Soviet dissidents are still contributing to the rewriting of history that diminishes the importance the world changing importance of the Soviet victory that so many of those who spoke so far have very rightfully reclaimed and showed us the importance of it. But that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Polina. Next, Citizen One, please go ahead, followed by Rich J.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say that I love this roundtable discussion idea and that I hope we occasionally have it again on especially certain eminent and eminently very critical topics. I love to hear other people's thoughts on these things. Before I make my comment and ask my question to the attendees, I just want to say, Alan, if I understood correctly, you said that the Koreans lost 3 million people fighting the Japanese, or I should say fighting Japan. Were you interjecting, Alan?
No, it's fighting Japan and the Americans, but mostly the Americans, actually. I think 2 to 3 million were killed in the Korean War. So if I said that, I misspoke. But I meant, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Korean War.
I may have heard that wrong.
Yeah.
I also want to say that a lot of people don't know this, and I don't know how many attendees here today know this, but it's ironic that Japanese Americans were interned on the West Coast when Japanese Americans were not interned in Hawaii. the very place where Japan's attack took place, and of course, the U.S. Pacific Naval Headquarters.
Right.
And one explanation for this is that Japanese Americans generally worked for each other or had their own businesses on the West Coast, whereas Japanese Americans in Hawaii generally worked for white people. So that's why they were not interned there. And I see Sharon nodding her head, and perhaps after I finish, I'd love to hear Sharon Rose. I'd love to hear any comments you have about that. So my two questions, if I may sneak into, and it may have been partially answered, but perhaps it could be fleshed out more. It seems that once again, Germany wants to send tanks through Ukraine to attack Russian forces in this US and NATO provoked proxy war. And I still sort of find it ununderstandable. Western Europe's psychotic and rabid Russia hatred, perhaps best exemplified by European Commission President and German official Ursula von der Leyen, in Europe's latest continental war by proxy, the US and NATO proxy war against Russia, but so far has not turned nuclear. And I think it's ironic that Trump, of all people, may end this war. But I just almost find it fascinating, the deeply rabid and psychotic hatred of Russia, to the extent where Western Europe is willing to almost deindustrialize itself by being forced to buy much more expensive US fossil fuels rather than Russian fossil fuels. And my other question for anyone who wants to respond to it is, so the history that I've seen on American TV is that Russia was caught off guard and was so unprepared for Hitler's invasion because Stalin had previously purged the Russian military prior to Hitler's invasion, and at first didn't even believe that Hitler had invaded. So if that's not correct, I'd be eager for anyone to correct that perspective on the history of World War II. Thank you.
Okay, actually, Raj, if you want to comment on that. I don't know if he's there.
I will, I'm here. On this particular comment, no.
On that particular
Yeah,
question.
Joseph, that's, I'm sorry if I identified you.
That's okay.
The charge that Stalin had weakened the military, the number of officers purged were about 7%, and about half of them were reinstated shortly. It did not, in fact, they had to purge because of the Trotsky and Zinoviev had attempted to decapitate the state and take over. Actually, it was Trotsky's plan to take over the state and make some compromise with Germany, mainly because he didn't think USSR could defeat Germany. So he was going to accept some of the German terms, and he worked with Germany. Such is the research that has been done by many people, the latest of who is Grover Furr. So if you read that, did I answer your question, or was the one part left out?
That was it. That was it.
And I think, I forgot to add to this American or Western perspective is that this purge took place because Stalin was so paranoid, his ego couldn't stand anyone that might threaten him. And so that's a part of it that I forgot to add.
Yeah, so that's all false. It's it's the kind of thing that both Western scholars, which have gotten millions of dollars paid for writing such books, and Trotsky's followers do, is to malign. If you read them, then you wonder how Soviet Union won. This is all false. A good book to read is Molotov Remembers. And that's an interview of Molotov over 17 years by a Russian poet. And a lot of these questions are asked. He very plainly explains each incident and what he saw. I'm not saying you believe Molotov completely, but I find Molotov's answer quite credible.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, that explanation is supposed to explain why Russia lost at least 30 million people. But if anyone else would like to add, if it hasn't already been sufficiently answered, why Western Europe seems so rabidly and psychotically anti-Russian.
That's good. Okay, let's go ahead with Rich J. If you would unmute, please, and make your comment, followed by Jim. So Rich J, please. There you go. You're
Okay,
unmuted. We can hear you and see you.
okay. I can't see myself, but I guess that's not important. So I have I really love this program, and I'll tell you why. A little context. I was born in late October of 1944. My father left for France and then Germany before I was born. I'm not exactly sure what month. Both my folks have passed away. But the essence of what I wanted to say today was that, and also the reason I said I love this program so much, it's very, very personal for me. And what I mean by that is, I didn't see my father until the middle of 1945. As soon as the war was over, I don't know exactly when he got home, but I was 9 months old. I know that. My mother told me that before she passed away, and I used to. My father brought back a box, two big boxes of paraphernalia from the war, and some of one was led to me to my second language when I got sent over to Germany during the Vietnam War. I got a draft notice. I joined and became a dental assistant, a medic. But I still remembered when I was 5, 6, 7 years old and got into the box of his stuff he brought back and found a German English dictionary, small handheld dictionary. And so I started reading, I started learning German when I was 6 or 7 years old, and not knowing that I would eventually get sent there and end up marrying a woman from Germany and having a son that's still in Berlin, 56 years old. And so Germany still is really important to me because my son's there, my first son, and his mom just passed away. And her father was, I believe, forced into the Nazi military, uh, but he he's learned English. I think he was a POW. Here's the bottom line. I'm getting off the point. The bottom line is that from the day I went and looked at all my dad's stuff he'd brought back, and then a handful of weapons, shotguns, and this and that, deer rifle, all kinds of stuff. It wasn't a deer rifle when it was made, but that's what he used it for. And but I would try to talk to him about what happened in the war as I got older than 5 or like 10 to 15 to 20. I would ask him questions, not enough, not the right. I didn't know the right questions to ask. I wasn't politicized yet. I didn't get seriously politicized until JFK was assassinated, and not because I felt strong about JFK, but my best friend did, and it flipped me. Went from Republican on my whole family to the German. And so my point is that I could never get him to talk. And the older I got, and especially when I came back from Germany and against the war in Vietnam and became politicized, I started to realize, especially then, that I was getting a little too close to the UFW, the farm workers, and Bobby Kennedy and stuff like that. And I turned against the war in Vietnam while I was in the military. And I only very vaguely knew what I was getting into when I got my draft notice. The point is that as I got older and started to get a political point of view, a historical political point of view, started to realize what was going on. I didn't understand it, but I did start to understand why my father wouldn't talk to me. And at first, and even for another 5 or 10 years up till probably I was at least 25, maybe older, after I got back from the service, I started to realize that, well, I know I said to myself and to my family that I was really proud of my father because he went and fought against the Nazis. And then it took me another number of years when I started to pick up all this anti-Russian sentiment that we've talked about all throughout today, that actually his commander-in-chief, Eisenhower, of the realm he was in the military, he was in the Army field artillery with a big gun, the longest big gun that didn't have its own motor. It wasn't a tank. Long Tom is called the Long Tom. That the reason that he would not talk about things and would always complain, or the only thing he ever said about politics was stay down the middle, like kind of like the Chinese middle road. You know, don't he didn't say don't go too far to the left or too far to the right. He didn't say that. But he was
Rich, go
not.
ahead and let's go ahead and wrap up because we got a lot.
My point is to make it clear with my father, and the whole history of this for me is I'm still learning a lot today of things that I never studied it, but I couldn't get words out of my father because I'm sure at some point he figured out that my ideas would clash with his, and he was too aware of that to want to get into a fight with me. He didn't want to kick me out of the house. He didn't want to fight with me.
Okay, thank
That's
you.
pretty much it. Yeah,
Thank you. Okay, next is Jim, Judith, and then Gal. So Jim, please go ahead and unmute. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. Go right ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So, yeah, well, this was kind of like my Forrest Gump moment. I landed in Moscow in September or October. I was just checking the timeline, trying to figure out exactly when. 93, as Yeltsin was dismissing the parliament and that kind of thing. I was going over for a psychological oriented trip. I was always looking for non-med ways to deal with the stuff I took out of the military. And part of the tour was to go to a cemetery. And I did not want to go to a cemetery. I wanted to go to a bar and drink with average Russians. But I figured out with the Cyrillic alphabet, I could not possibly find the tour group. So the cemetery was packed. And I said to the tour guide, I said, is this your Russian Memorial Day? And he said, no, it's like this every day. And I went, wow, this is really something. And then I came to learn that 26 million Russians had died. And that, of course, explains it. But this is something the average American doesn't have a clue about. And I was just lucky enough to be there and experience the collective grief the Russian people have and clearly understand why they do not trust this country, NATO, and they're not being with Putin because they're terrified of him. They're way more terrified of us. I would add one other story quickly. When I was coordinator of the nuclear weapons freeze campaign, I went to Moscow. I met with the peace committee. I was in San Diego at that time, I should say, coordinator of San Diego. And I met with the peace committee. I sat across them and said, my government tells me you're a communist front group and you're all paid. They said, we're all volunteers and we're terrified. It turned out the Russian people knew more about Carl Sagan than the average American.
Thank you, Jim. Very heartfelt. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Next is Judith, followed by Gal. Judith, please go ahead. Please unmute.
Okay.
We can hear you.
All right. Good. Good. All right. Okay. Well, my earliest memory of the Second World War, I must have been, I don't know, 3, something like that. And my mother took me to a place where she got coupons to use for food. And I don't know why I remembered that, but yeah. Okay, so yes, I watched the Victory Day parade, and I was very impressed, and I was especially impressed when at the end Putin embraced the North Korean general and hugged him and held his hand for a really long time. So it seemed to be a genuine emotion. But at any rate, I wanted to ask Sharon, during the Second World War, what was the American Communist Party's position on the death camps, the concentration camps, and the whole Jewish question, and actually what was the prevalent opinion in the United States as a whole, and was it any different from that of the Communist Party? And the other thing I'd like to say is that, addressing what Janet said, I just read before coming on here an article in the New York Times that Trump is opening up a golf course in Vietnam. And I didn't read the whole article, but they interviewed some of the local people, and this one guy said that he's really opposed to it because they're going to tear down the cemetery and they're going to use agricultural land. And he said, but what can he do? He can't oppose it. He has to agree to it. And also, this is not Russia. This is not Russia refusing to directly help the Palestinians. This is China. Vanessa Beeley, I posted this in the chat. Vanessa Beeley has been posting articles about how the Chinese are assisting Israel, and they're building all kinds of infrastructure in Israel. And not only that, but her latest piece was about how China is now assisting the new Syrian terrorist government. Okay, so that's all.
Okay. Next is Mary. Please go ahead and unmute.
Okay. First of all, I wanted to follow up on Sharon's thing on the Communist Party and the Japanese Americans being sent to camp. They not only did not go against it, they supported it and they collaborated in it. And they actually expelled all of their Japanese members at the time. And so, one of the people that we knew, Kazu Ijima, she did protest, as a party member, and wrote, letter of protest to the Politburo, but, to no avail. And people like Carl Yoneda, who I'm sure a lot of Bay Area people knew was a, very loyal Communist Party member. He went to camp with his wife, Elaine Black, and they supported the whole effort. They worked, God, when I think about it, it's horrible. As a still as a loyal CP member supporting the party line. He was working with the Japanese American Citizens League, who were total collaborators with the government on the camps. As far as Hawaii, if they had evacuated all the Japanese in Hawaii, their economy would have just stopped, because the Japanese were so integrated into the labor economy there. They did set up a detention camp for high security risk in Hawaii, but, for the most part, they needed the people to be working. And then as far as the West Coast, a lot of the people that were in camp, like my father, they went to work as farm laborers. They were, you know, after a period of time, they were let out of camp under supervision to help with the farm labor because there was a huge labor shortage because of the war. And then also because of the evacuation of the Japanese on the West Coast. And I was surprised, I found this recently on Wikipedia. They verified that California agribusiness got its start after the camp, or because of the camps, because the Japanese had so much of the, you know, agricultural farmland, and they were actually, you know, the main ones growing, and they lost it all because of that. So, thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to go to Raj, who said he wanted to comment on some of the other presentations. So Raj, please go ahead.
Yeah, just very briefly. Sharon raised the issue of, and I think somebody else just now did, on the Japanese internment at Communist Party. So I just want to say this issue of nationalism affects communist parties. I mean, most of the communist parties is Second World War. Even before First World War, they were against the war, and then they voted for their governments to raise funds for the war. Only the Russian Communist Party didn't. So I think the nationalism is a very powerful force. And given the Second World War was after the Pearl Harbor, I think the Communist Party caved in to that pressure in the United States. But I think the question of nationalism should be discussed. It was wrong, but I'm saying this is the pressure. And then the Communist Party itself is not in a capitalist country, has to function. It's a very powerful capitalist country. So therefore, behind this mistake lies those pressures. Not to defend it, but I think that seems to me. One quick comment on Jean, who quoted Churchill, and I appreciate that comment of Churchill to say that it was the Soviet forces that destroyed the German fighting army. That's correct. But in my estimation and our history, Churchill played no less a destructive role than Hitler played in Europe. Okay, 3 million people died of starvation in 1943 in Bengal, which was full 5% of the population, because they were shipping grain for war effort. When the war effort didn't require the grain, it was a backup. Okay, so Churchill was a racist and imperialist to the core. And I don't want any impression left about Churchill that can be. He was next only to Hitler, in my opinion, in humanity. And then one comment on Janet's thing about Russia not severely criticized. Russia has made criticism of Israel, although it's a muted criticism of attack. I mean, how civilian population are being killed. Two things here I want to say. One is Russian. There has been consideration, of course, of Russian immigrants, but there is a popular Russian sympathy for Jewish people who suffered in the Second World War. That is part of their history. That's, memory of that history. And because that they fought to end that was along with end of their occupation. So that's one reason. The second is, although we can understand that the tactic in Israel by Hamas came out of desperation, but yet it was a terrorist tactic. It is very difficult to support that. We can understand it, but supporting it is kind of hard. So I think as a state, it becomes hard for Russia. And I think that's what I see. Those are my 3 comments. Thank you.
Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to give Sharon a chance to respond. Then Norma, please, we'll go with that. So Sharon, please go ahead.
Thank you, Alan. I just wanted to respond to a couple of questions and add one more thing. Citizen raised the question about the Japanese Americans in Hawaii, and Mary Gao answered that. I think that they worked on the docks, a lot of them. Yes, they worked for white people, but they worked on the docks, and that was so important in terms of the initial war effort. And they also worked a lot in farming, which was, of course, extremely important for the production of food for the war. Speaking of food, Judith mentioned ration books, and there was the rationing of sugar and other, I don't remember what else. I got this story from my mother. But there was rationing of items that were needed for the armed forces, and also they needed green coloring, green dye for the uniforms, I guess. And the packages of Lucky Strike cigarettes were changed to eliminate the green dye, and they had a slogan called "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war." I wanted to also, Judith raised the question of what was the Communist Party's position on the concentration camps, the oppression of Jews in Europe. And before I answer, I don't really know the answer to that, but I'll say just 1-2 sentences. But before I say that, there's no organization whose name is the American Communist Party. It was and is the Communist Party USA, just like there's no organization called the Chinese Communist Party. It's the Communist Party of China, and other countries as well. And that is done on purpose because, with regard to the national question, in fact, you don't have to be a Chinese nationality to be a member of that party. You just have to be a person who is living in China, et cetera. And as I mentioned, erroneously, the CPUSA expelled 4,000 foreign-born non-citizens who were members of the party. And that was a major error on their part. Anyway, about the Jewish question, the communists were definitely opposed to the Nazi oppression of Jews. A lot of what was going on in the actual genocide against Jews was not completely verified or known. The extent of it was not completely known in the West, but I think they can't be faulted for their position on the Jewish question, except after the war, and in 1948, where this leadership of the Soviet Union and communist parties elsewhere, including the United States, supported the partition of Palestine, that when it came up in the United Nations. I just wanted to add, speaking of trying to fight against the distortion of history, a good book to read is The Red Orchestra, which is a history of the resistance in the occupied countries of Western Europe against the Nazis. The name comes from the fact that the German command called it an orchestra that was playing every night in code on the wireless radio transmissions to Moscow of intelligence from all the occupied countries in the West, in particular France, but also Belgium and the other occupied countries, giving the Soviets some some intelligence that was needed. And it's a pretty good book. Some of the tactics they used are still applicable today. Like when they would have meetings, they would say they would say to each other when the next meeting was, but everybody knew that it was actually going to be a day later than that or whatever. They arranged in advance the code of when the meetings were going to be. And then finally, there was propaganda in favor of what the U.S. entry and fighting in the war and in the United States, and there was pro-Soviet propaganda, and it is best viewed in a series of 7 films that were produced by Frank Capra for the U.S. Army called Why We Fight. There's 7 different films, and you can find them on Wikipedia. If you search Why We Fight, there's and it explains the history of how how those were produced, and you can actually go. There's links to each one of them, and I recommend all of them, but in particular the first one, and also the one about Russia, why we're fighting on the side of the Soviets. And finally, there was the film called Mission to Moscow, which was a dramatization of the diary of Davies, who was the ambassador in Moscow during the pre-war and wartime. And it was extremely controversial when it came out because it was pro-Soviet, or at least not anti-Soviet. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Norma, please go ahead, followed by Peter. So Norma, go ahead.
Okay, hello, everybody. The war has been going on for 100, this series of war has been going on for 100+ years because the Russians had the Russian Revolution, and the owners, our owners, which people say I'm not owned, but we all are. We are all slaves of the profiteering that our owners get from our labor and subservience. It's been a war against that. Why else invade the border countries? They weren't Russia. They weren't even that allied with Russia, but they were a danger to the thinking of people who would be thinking in terms of liberation, modeling after the after the Russian Revolution. All the way out to Afghanistan. Afghanistan, my goodness. What a terrible thing to have going on that was part of the attempt to suppress liberation struggle. I have a note in here in the chat that says that the organizations, when I was littler, I was born in 1935. I'm Jewish. And I'm communist. My folks, I've told you, I'm third generation communist. So I knew about the lampshades that were made out of skins of Jews by the Hitler group. I've told people about Mao-Maoing. You probably never have heard of it, but people were I know Sharon, yeah, good. People were complaining about being Mao-Maoed by these people. The terrorists, the people we are obligated to call terrorists, are the liberationists. Hamas is a liberating group. The whole world sees their liberatory behavior. It is not about just Russia and just China, although they're allied in our thinking about it because of good reasons. I think that covers the extent of what I wanted to get out.
Thank you, Norma. Okay, next is Peter. So please go ahead, Peter. Unmute.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
We can hear you.
I since this is kind of a memorial type of a tribute to victory over fascism. I just want to share one story of a fellow that I was very close to when I was young. When I say young, I mean like 23, 22. I met him in Worcester, Massachusetts, because his son, I gone to school with his son, they said, "Oh, you're going to Worcester? You got to talk to my father." I said, "Okay." I went to talk to his father. And this guy turns out to be a communist, a member of the Communist Party. He was really running the Communist Party throughout the Depression in Worcester in World War II. So I asked him to come and speak at a May Day rally that I had organized in Worcester. This is back in the 80s. And he came and he spoke, and he was commemorating the victory over fascism. And not because, because of course May 9th was right around the corner, but also because he participated in it. His name was Henry Grossman. He had actually gone to Spain and fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, along with his friends from Worcester, many of whom died, were killed. He was wounded. And he told me, he said, I'm not doing this because it's the right thing to do. I'm not doing this because it's popular. He says, I'm doing it because I have to. And, he said, everything you've heard about the Soviet Union is wrong. Everything you heard about Stalin is wrong. He said, when he got involved in the party and started to organize hundreds of people or thousands of people in protests down the central square in Worcester, he said in the 1940s, he went down to New York from Worcester. And Worcester is a very heavy industrial city, very poor, all the immigrants, very working class. And he went to New York to the party headquarters. And there's Earl Browder. And he said, he went to Earl Browder's office and he saw this magnificent, huge desk. He said, I'd never seen such a monstrous, beautiful, ornate, expensive desk with office all trimmed out to the highest degree. And he said, I felt like I was in a bourgeois, corporate management suite. He said it was unbelievable. And he said, that was the moment I knew something was really wrong, desperately wrong in the party. And he said, the second warning came during the phony war period, which I don't think anyone's mentioned, but this is not simply a Browder thing. This is also a Comintern thing. The Comintern told all parties to not to encourage intervention in the war against Germany. This was after Germany invaded Poland. 6 months there was the Comintern directive not to provoke Germany not to get involved in American involvement in the war. And he said that was a horrible, horrible mistake because, being a Jew, he knew exactly what was going on in Germany. And he was always trying to encourage intervention, even during the so-called war, which the party didn't support. And then, of course, once they invaded France, they did a 180 and encouraged intervention against Germany. So there's nothing simple about blaming everything on one person or even on nationalism. There's a very complex interaction between this kind of deviations from Marxism or liberalism that seeps into communist parties. And so we're not perfect. The Communist Party was not perfect. Even the Soviets were not perfect in their war against Hitler, but the people were perfect. And people like Henry Grossman gave his whole life to the party and to fighting fascism. And he was the one that told me that when Israel was formed, the entire Jewish community became reactionary. I couldn't believe what he was saying, and he told me that Israel was a fascist country. I said, "Are you kidding me?" But he was much more farsighted than I was, and I just want to remember him on this day. We really have to remember those people that came before us and made possible the communist movement for us. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Next, I'm going to go to Jean. So Jean, please go ahead and unmute. Jean, go ahead and unmute. There
I'm
you go.
unmuted, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I want to assure Raj that I'm no fan of Winston Churchill. He may have been a great war leader, but he also thought that the best way of dealing with the inferior races was through poison gas. So he was not a good person in many respects. But I also just wanted to say, that, when we had our Industrial Revolution here in the West, it was carried out on the backs of poor working class people. And it involved basically, working young children as young as 6 years old to death in these satanic mills in New York and Boston and elsewhere. And Stalin, being the horrible tyrant that he was, sent all these kids to school, basically, forced them to learn how to read and write, not only technical journals and manuals, but also the great works, not only of Russian literature, but also world literature. And I remember somebody saying that every Soviet boy daydreams about floating down the Mississippi River with Jim, with Huck Finn and all this sort of stuff. So I think we need to acknowledge the more humanistic side of socialist education here. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, Citizen One, and we're almost at the end of our time. So Citizen One, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, the British people certainly gave Churchill the heave-ho right after World War II. I just wanted to say, I know about the German lampshades made out of Jewish skin claim. And I would say, Norma, please don't verbally jump on me for saying this, but I also heard that story was apocryphal. I certainly don't minimize Nazi horrors against Jews or anyone else, but I found that so ghoulish that any average person would have lamps in their homes made of anyone's skin. That I kind of, well, let me finish. I kind of believe that story is apocryphal, but certainly respond to that right after I'm done. I just wanted to say to Sharon Rose, I found that very funny about the meeting toads, and to Raj's comments about communists being nationalists. That to me sounds like an oxymoron. The thing about the West Coast Japanese that I found ironic, and Sharon, I think you and maybe someone else responded to this, is that, the propaganda was that West Coast Japanese could be sending secret semaphore lights and radio signals, to Japan. Well, I mean, they certainly could be doing it right in the state of the Pacific Naval Headquarters, and yet they weren't in turn there for reasons that people have partially explained. Also, Japanese farms and especially orchards on the West Coast, and anyone can correct me where I'm wrong or short, I understand were very coveted because Japanese Americans, I should have said Japanese Americans, but Japanese American farms and orchards were very coveted because they were very skilled in agriculture, and especially orchards. I mean, anyone hear about, fruit from Japan, how it's raised, and, they like practically grow the fruit individually and put it in little baskets, and it's, they make it perfect. The last thing someone may respond to, I hope if they have time, and Norma, also you please respond to me if they have time. Angela Davis of the Communist Party, I assume she still is, of all people, said that Obama was the apotheosis of the Black struggle. And I just could not believe that any thinking person, let alone someone who presumably still calls herself a communist, could ever say such a thing. Thank you.
She does call herself a communist, but she's not a member of the party. She's left with the major split that happened in 1989 or 90.
How could she call Obama the apotheosis and call herself a communist at all?
Gotta ask her.
Okay. All right, we need to actually
This
wrap because
time?
we're at the very end of our time here. I want to just say personally, I want to thank everybody who participated in today's discussion. I think this is one of the best sessions that we've had on
Yes.
Sunday morning. And I think it really, I myself, in these difficult times, find comfort in these Sunday morning sessions and the contributions of each and every one of you who spoke up and attended today, in knowing that people are aware, that people have a spirit of fight and understand history and appreciate history and the sacrifices that have been made in the past, that of the shoulders of the people that we stand on. So we've got tremendous challenges ahead. I want to say next week we have a very important program. Simone Chun of the Korea Policy Institute is going to be speaking about what's going on in Korea. Not covered very broadly in the news, but there was a coup. I think a lot of you are aware of that. It was overturned on the basis of a mass movement that involved 10 million South Koreans marching in the street in sub-freezing temperatures, the Revolution of Light. In opposition to it, an anti-coup candidate has been barred from the election in a judicial coup that's coming up on June 3rd. She's going to be speaking on June 1st. I want to invite everybody to sign up on our email list by going to our website, icssmarks.org. And again, I want to just express my appreciation for everybody who participated today in this session. And as we all know, we want to give a big red salute to the brave Soviet people and all the people who resisted the Nazis during World War II, probably the finest in that humanity has to offer. So thank you very much. And with that, let's stop the recording.